Hello and welcome to this week's live debate on eNCA.com. Today we ask a very simple question. Should South Africa's rich pay more tax? Now we know the country is one of the most unequal in the world. The government is struggling to balance its books. But activists and analysts around the world are saying, well, it's the tax stupid, raise your taxes. It's been alleged that rich people across the world find clever ways and schemes to shift their income and their revenues and their profits around to avoid paying taxes. We also know that in South Africa, we have extremely wealthy individuals, but also very poor people. Joining me in studio to deal with this very vexed debate, we have Lulu Krugel, who is Chief Economist at KPMG, and also Proven Moodley, who is Associate Country Director at Oxfam International. I'll ask with a very simple question. Would you live in a country that charged zero taxes, zero rates for tax? Moodley.
It sounds like a good idea, but the short answer is no. The reason is that it has to be an utopia where markets work perfectly and there needs to be no government intervention. So if you need government intervention in the market, you need taxes of some sort. Even if everybody is employed, everybody has a gainful job and is earning good money, I can't see how it would function. The world just doesn't work that way.
Okay.
Yeah,
Proven?
I would have to agree. I think if it was a completely different system and way of operating, so if there was some system where, people in the country owned everything, it would be very different. But the current system means that, certain individuals own assets and so on, and those need to be taxed. So, I don't think it will work in the kind of governance system that we have currently. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of basic taxes, I think we agree that everyone has to pay their fair share. But then we'll go is that fair share and what does this mean? I'm Trudy Makhaya, resident economic analyst here at eNCA. I suppose if the question had to be posed to me, I would tend to agree with you guys. We'll be taking comments from some of our online audience as we go along. But to start off with, let's just get the facts right. How much do the wealthy contribute to the tax take in South Africa?
Well, if we take the top tax bracket for individuals, that would be
We apologize for that technical glitch. Now, back to you, Proven. We've heard from Lulu that at the top rate, certainly people are contributing the bulk of taxes. So in a sense, one could say that that's what one would expect. So where are the problems that we see in the way tax policy is structured in South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is not about looking for more tax. It's starting with people paying their tax. So if you look at a SARS investigation, they estimate there's about 20,000 high net worth individuals. These are individuals that earn more than 7 million per annum, or have assets in the amount of 75 million or more. And what they found was, of the 20,000, there's 9,300 that have been identified by SARS. Only 7,000 are registered, and of those, 2,300 are not tax compliant at all. So there's a very small number of the high net worth individuals that are fully tax compliant and are paying, their fair share. So, it's not just a question of policy, but it's in practice who's actually paying their tax.
So, but could one argue that even if those people paid more of their taxes, it wouldn't make much of a difference?
I would say, we need to look at this in two senses. One is look at individuals, so these high net worth individuals that make a lot of money. But a lot of them are part of big companies and corporations as well. And I think that's where, a lot of the wealth, and money is leaving the country. So the recent eNCA report that was just released at the AU summit shows that 50 billion US dollars annually leaves the continent. And, it's been like 1 trillion over 50 years. So it's through, different practices by these companies that money is leaving, without getting into the fiscus. And those are the things that, I think we need to start dealing with.
So 50 billion is just frittering away from the continent. What are some of the practices that companies use to, move this vast sum out of the continent?
Well, a lot of it is perfectly legal, but it's sometimes a question of alignment of policies between different countries. If you start looking at money that is moving across borders, then immediately, the moment that two countries have different approaches in treating taxes, international treaties and so on, that becomes problematic. So in some instances where there are misuse, which obviously happens when one can't deny that, it is sometimes misuse of tax treaties that exist between countries, and the way in which transfer pricing is handled between different entities. And that was also one of the areas that was addressed by the recent publication of the Davis Commission, to align South Africa's transfer pricing practices with what's happening in the rest of the world.
But is it legal? I mean, when someone over invoices their goods so that they pay too much to an overseas subsidiary, and therefore, reflect losses in South Africa. I mean, is all of that legal?
Well, I'm not going to say that I'm a tax expert, but in some instances you can say you can get away with it, but is it right? Is it morally correct, and is it the right thing to do? I suppose you can get away with a lot of things if you try to, but technically, no, it's not legal. And I think the way in which transfer pricing has been or is going to be dealt with in South Africa, it's about documenting the processes, documenting how you came to those prices that you are charging, the other company on the other side of the border and so on. That, for example, was things that we haven't done in South Africa. What has happened is it was, as I understand, left to a large extent to the company's discretion, and now you should be able to prove. So if you cannot prove why you've made those decisions and you are charging the prices that you're charging, then obviously SARS could come after you.
Okay, so SARS could come after you if, clearly you're flouting some laws. But I suppose the difficulty I'm having here is that actually some of this does sound like it's legal. So, and people are just simply optimizing their taxes. They go live, say, on the Isle of Man, as Mark Shuttleworth does. Is this an issue? And is there a way that we should be sending a message to the wealthy that perhaps they should be thinking about this differently? How should they be thinking about this differently?
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is a common practice, and the eNCA report and many other reports, the Davis Tax Commission is looking at it. I mean, just to give you an example, recently there was a multinational that had subsidiaries in the UK and Switzerland. And through this practice of, I mean, essentially they had junior staff members, a few of them in each of those countries, and saying they've got a big operation there. So every transaction that happened in South Africa went back, to the UK or Switzerland to show that, that kind of relationship, and therefore, moved most of the money and was taxed at a much lower rate. This process cost the country 2 billion. And so, the South African government, with SARS and through its investigation, realized what was happening, and then essentially went after this multinational company and is trying to get that money back. So what I'm saying is, at least there's some move in terms of saying, these practices are there, but they're not right. And we need to start closing down. These are, the companies see it as tax loopholes. So there was a scandal that broke yesterday with HSBC, where they were advising their clients, that earned over $1 million in terms of putting money in certain tax havens. That scandal just broke. But this is common practice.
There's so many of these tax havens where people can move their finances to them, and they either pay very little or almost no tax. And they're very light citizenship requirements. So, you're a South African citizen, you're educated here, your whole life is here, you made the money here, but you can go claim citizenship elsewhere, live there, pay no tax. Yeah. Shouldn't we just shut them down, these tax havens?
Yeah, I think, they've been set up in a way that's been, quite complex. But at the same time, this requires a global solution. So, for example, South Africa, isn't going to be able to go to a tax haven and, try and shut that down. It requires a global effort,
so they
a global
also have
agreement.
To agree in a sense.
Yeah, but also, getting, especially if you look at like the G20, BRICS and so on. It's these kinds of groupings that really need to come together. They have started looking at it. So, the G20 is looking at a base erosion, profit shifting, looking at that issue. But again, the challenge is a lot of the kind of developing countries are not really part of that process. So, it's a few countries that are, making the decisions on behalf of others.
Okay. So, some countries making decisions on behalf of others in a way that we're almost powerless until we get together and find a global solution. But Lulu, coming back to South Africa, forgetting about the loopholes, just looking at the level of inequality, shouldn't taxes at the high rate be set in a way that are supposed to use this word to confiscate excessive wealth in a country such as ours? In the way, for instance, someone like Thomas Piketty has been arguing that inequality in itself creates such a negative atmosphere that it's not only that we should expect them to pay tax, but if you look at the top tax rate, that 40% or so puts a middle manager in a company in the same bracket as a multi-millionaire, in the same bracket as a billionaire. Yeah. Shouldn't we just have like 80% tax at the top?
Yeah. Trudy, it is, if you live in a country like South Africa, things like that, I'm sure must cross people's minds. There's two problems. The one is poverty. But if you're in a country where everybody around you is poor, I suppose it's not better, but it's maybe socially less destabilizing where you're sitting with a country where there's a large population that's poor and quite a number of people that are doing quite well for themselves. So inequality is really dangerous. I agree with you. But it's a very fine line. It's about, giving people the opportunity to become entrepreneurs, to know that if they're successful, they will get something in return if they work hard. It's about also sending a message to companies that it is worthwhile to invest in a particular country. At the end of the day,
can I stop you there? The message there, it's worthwhile to invest in a particular country. But shouldn't we be changing that message? Because, companies should come in and invest in a country that's stable, that is giving its citizenship access to health and education, that is able to fund those things through taxes. So shouldn't they prefer that rather than a country that is fighting to the death to get every crumb, but infrastructure is decaying? They can hardly do business. So what's the point?
No, I can't argue with that. But at the end of the day, personally, I think the best thing would be is trying to find a balance between growing the tax base. If you look at the number of people that actually have jobs that is sufficient for them to be able to pay taxes, that is one of the largest concerns that we have in South Africa. In other countries, indirect taxes and personal income taxes are much more important shares of their overall tax base than, let's say, corporate taxes. So it's about growing the tax base, it's about giving more people access to jobs, and it is a fine balance. I completely agree. It's not something that you're going to be able to do overnight, and trying to clamp down on individuals that should be paying tax that's not paying taxes, nobody can find any fault with that.
Okay. So better compliance and grow the tax base. Is that enough?
Yeah, but I'm going to come back to your point around the inequality and what's it doing to the country, right? And just, yesterday, Obama in one of his speeches was talking about wealth and inequality, and he was saying we don't really resent their success. On the other hand, just as a practical matter, if we're going to pay for schools and infrastructure and so on, and you have such a skewed world, right, in terms of inequality, the richest 1% will own more than the rest in 2016. In South Africa, you have 2 of the richest people that have the same wealth as the bottom 50% of the population, right? Just to give you an idea of how skewed it is. And, President Zuma, in his pre-SONA briefing with media, he was talking about inequality as a ticking time bomb in South Africa, right? So, things are volatile. And, I think inequality is going to have major impacts in terms of that volatility, in terms of crime in South Africa, and a range of other, social aspects besides, the economic aspects. And I think, as a country, we therefore need to deal with this quite holistically. So I think, tightening the loopholes, looking at taxation. Again, for me, it's more about ensuring we have progressive taxation, right? It's not that, there's certain people right at the top that, it's about how you progressively tax people, throughout the tax scale, right? But ensuring that, obviously those at the top who have made much more, often based on the assets of a country, etc., should be paying more. But it, for me, it's a holistic solution, as we go up that kind of tax ladder, to make sure we are, taxing progressively.
Okay, so taxing progressively. I'll just give you some comments that we have from Twitter. We have someone, Karabo Udi, who says, if you tax the rich more, that will mean you'll be getting punished for hard work you put on to be that rich. I don't think that will reflect a positive message on equality for all. So almost saying that you tax the rich, you're actually saying, stay at home, don't work. Some economists have argued that the higher you increase your taxes, you increase your revenue, but then you get to a point where revenue doesn't increase anymore, it actually starts falling. So really, how progressive can it ever be in a world where you want to incentivize hard work?
Yeah. I think, often, that argument is used, right, in terms of hard work. And I think no one denies that hard work is important, making the economy work is important. But at the same time, we need to make sure that it's inclusive. So not where, for example, the disparities and the inequalities. There's plenty of examples in the mining sector in South Africa, for example, where it would take a rock driller, I can't remember the exact stat, but let's say 10 years, to earn, a 1 month's salary of a CEO, for example. So, part of it is looking at, that disparity. So it's not saying, people that have done well should not earn well. So, but part of it is looking at that disparity in terms of, you're earning well, but your workers are being paid, a minimal amount, for example.
But as someone saying, Yamkela Mfunda here says, being rich is your own skill, so you cannot be penalized for your great skill. So if you are contributing to that company and somebody, you're giving instructions, you're being creative, you're innovating, and somebody else isn't putting as much of that effort, surely you should be getting the fruits of your labor, so to speak.
Okay, so if you take the same example, 20,000 high net worth individuals, right? Let's say they've all earned their wealth, they've been really outstanding, innovative, etc. the fact that, let's say, only 230 of them are actually fully tax compliant means, okay, it's fine, they've earned their money, but the reality is they're not paying their fair share, right? And their fair share is what the current tax rate is. You know, it's not an increased tax rate.
But Ruben, I think let's move away from the compliance point. Let's
Okay.
say whether they're compliant or not.
Yeah.
But you were saying you want to tax them almost to even up the scale.
No, I mean, I don't think you can tax, the super rich to the point where, you squeeze every bit out of them. I mean, I don't think that's progressive taxation. As I said, I mean, I think there should be a fair scale going, from the bottom upward. So, in France, for example, they were looking at a certain wealth rate and then looking at an 80% tax. I mean, the Constitutional Court in France said, actually, this is it's inequality and it's not, it's not fair. So, the idea is not to, what I'm saying is go, 80%. No. It's about, putting in a reasonable standard, but a standard where, people are compliant, but also where, people can still grow their businesses, etc. But a big part of that is how, that contribution comes back into the fiscus.
So that contribution coming back into the fiscus is very important to you. But is there ever a world where we can say, actually, at the top, especially focusing on companies, if you're looking at company tax, actually, you might want to give companies lots of tax breaks for them to invest. You might want them to actually have, I mean, there was a time when there were tax holidays where companies didn't pay taxes for a certain period of time. Does that make sense from a country that's trying to attract investment?
Trudy, if we look at what we need to compete against as South Africa, for example, there's been a big drive from government to set up these special economic zones, moving away from what they call the industrial development zones, looking to what the rest of the world is doing. The countries that we're competing with, Singapore, for example, other developing countries, they have a lot of special tax dispensations to attract investors. And yes, it is important. It is something that there's been a lot of focus on. Government has been trying to make it easier for companies to comply. It's not always about the rates, it's about the processes, it's about, a lot of factors, the cost of doing business as a total that plays a role, and the ease of doing business in a particular country, and what other kinds of support is given. Having said that, it is sometimes, I think, a little bit more difficult for a country such as South Africa that is so dependent on tax revenue from corporate taxes and from individuals to say how should we balance this to make sure that we get enough money in to be able to do what we need to do. And that not only includes looking after our citizens, but also providing the infrastructure and so on to attract further investment. So it's not an easy task, but we are up against some tough competition, and it's about finding that point where the tax revenue that you're going to lose is going to be less than the investment that you're going to gain at the end.
Okay, so a very tight balance that governments have to balance, but it's almost such a closed space. You're almost spinning all the time because you want to have as much investment as possible, but then to attract that investment, you have to look good as a country, have the infrastructure, so that requires spending on tax. So there's all of these considerations that your tax policy have to look into. But I wonder if we're just obscuring just some basic facts. So we have, for instance, a comment here from Sihle Ngobese on Twitter, once again saying, no, we shouldn't raise taxes on the rich. And he says, I mean, to what end? So that Zuma can upgrade Nkandla, fund bottomless pit SAA, pay crooked ANC tenderpreneurs, I can't even pronounce that name properly, tenderpreneurs. So you see, he's listed a litany of sins that have been committed or are alleged to have been committed using tax money. And then the question becomes, we can talk about all of these niceties about reducing inequality, having a progressive tax, but haven't governments, our government, but governments across the world really given tax a bad name simply because of how the money is spent?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, it's a full circle. So the revenue side is one thing and how much you collect. But once you have that money in your fiscus, it's what you do with it. And there's plenty of examples across the world of how money has been badly spent. Corruption, poor management, etc., etc. And, I mean, there's plenty of examples of that, in South Africa as well. And so, and it brings back the point that, it's not just about the one side. You have to ensure that the whole line from your revenue collection to how money is spent, that there's accountability and good governance across the whole board. And I agree, there's no point in collecting a lot of money if you're going to be wasting that money. And that's why I think, as well, citizens have got a crucial role to play. Both on the revenue collection side in terms of ensuring multinationals are paying their fair share as an example, but at the same time looking at how money is being spent and raising the issues, putting pressure, etc., to make sure there is good governance and accountability. Or else, there's not much point in raising money if you're going to spend it badly.
Okay, so don't raise it unless you're going to spend it properly. Now, we also have a comment from someone called Truth Extractor. I like the name Truth Extractor. And once again, he says the rich create jobs, investment, don't chase them away. But he raises an intriguing suggestion, rather increase tax on super luxury goods. So in a sense, he's going after consumption and luxury rather than productive investments. Now, Lulu, you've thought, you're an economist and you've thought about some of the fiscal policy issues. Where are the opportunities to increase taxes?
Well, we can look at VAT, for example, on luxury goods. That's something that's happening in a lot of other countries. Economists might sometimes argue, listen, if you increase VAT on luxury items or super luxury items, your yacht, your very fancy cars, all these kinds of things, then at the end of the day, you're not taxing somebody for investing and earning, but you're taxing them when they make the decision to spend. And in that way also, it's not negatively impacting on the poor. It might not be a huge source of revenue, but every little bit helps. And if we look at what we paid in terms of VAT for imported goods last year, not to say that all imported goods are luxury goods, it's becoming a larger share of our VAT payments. So maybe it's not such a bad idea. Very often VAT is seen as something that's easy to administer, relatively cheap to collect, easy to make sure that that compliance takes place, and less disruptive to the economy. But it's very important as to where you levy it. It's not something, again, that you want to introduce a new form of regressive taxation on the poor.
Exactly, because I think that's one of the things that have been said about VAT, that then you have to have a whole system to ensure that it doesn't affect the poorest in society. So now, of course, we talk about all of this in the run-up to the budget that will be presented later this month. The finance minister has made it clear that he will be looking for extra sources of revenue. And so I'm going to ask our panelists to just give us a sense of what their wish list would be to the finance minister in terms of the way he administers tax policy and also the way he raises this extra revenue. So, Pooven, what would you say to him?
I think the answers are quite simple. So one would be these high net worth individuals that are not paying their taxes, and I'm not talking about increasing their taxes, paying what they should be paying. So I think SARS does more work around identifying these individuals and ensuring that they are tax compliant. I think that would be a starting point. Two, I think with the work of the Davis Commission, with the work of the Mbeki panel at the AU level, I think there's a lot of evidence that's coming out. So this report that's just come out on initial illicit financial flows, has the whole story, the practice, to what extent, but also offering solutions to close those kind of loopholes, by practices like transfer pricing and so on. And I think in South Africa we've got quite good people in the sense of have the expertise, we have the mechanisms and so on, unlike many other countries that don't have our infrastructure to do this. So I think closing those loopholes and ensuring that money remains will also help. The last thing I would say is to also explore other innovative ways. So one thing we've been pushing for is financial transaction tax that is a tax on kind of higher level financial transactions that looks at currency speculations and so on, and the kind of bigger kind of casino banks in the world and how money is moved from place to place. So a tax there that's not going to really affect people living in the country, but the bigger transactions that are happening.
Okay, so lots of suggestions there about activities that in a sense you think should be discouraged or should be contributing more towards tax revenue. Lulu, your final thoughts on tax policy for Mr. Nene?
Well, the Davis Commission is still busy with its work, so I suppose the initial decisions that would be made would probably be made with that in mind and to see what comes out of the final reports. Having said that, if we think about, for example, fruitless and wasteful expenditure last year, that was almost 3 billion, and that is equal to an amount of a 1% increase in the marginal tax rate for the upper income bracket. So clamp down on those kinds of things as well. Not saying we shouldn't look at tax compliance and so on, but we've done a lot there, and SARS has also brought down their cost of tax collection to less than 1% of the total amount that they're collecting, which is really world class. So look at the way in which we spend the money as well. That is extremely important.
Okay. Well, thanks to our panel for those very insightful remarks. I think they reflect what we're also seeing on our social media, that there are a lot of considerations to take into account. Tax is a very nuanced subject, but one that we all have to take much more interest in, given how much it determines what can or cannot happen in the country. Some comments on Twitter say, increase the tax base, don't punish those who are creating jobs, while others are saying, well, inequality is rife. Perhaps taxation is one way to deal with this scourge that threatens to destabilize a country. So very divided views. We'll see how the finance minister tackles his quest to increase revenue in the next budget. The conversation continues online on hashtag eNCA Live. We'll talk some more and get more comments. And of course, we'll be back next Tuesday at the same time at eNCA.com. I'm Trudy Makhaya. Thank you.